What if I told you that the commoner bride who walked into St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981 was never really a commoner at all? What if the shy young woman in the ivory gown carried bloodlines older, purer, and in some ways even more royal than the Windsors themselves? The world thought they were watching a fairy tale. In truth, history was coming full circle. The woman stepping into that carriage wasn't just marrying into royalty, she was bringing it back. Diana Spencer's blood contained secrets that had been hidden for centuries, connections to kings and queens deliberately erased from official records, and dynastic claims that could have rewritten the history of England itself. To understand this, we must step far away from the flashing cameras of the 1980s and walk into the ancestral halls of Althorpe House, Diana's childhood home. Here, portraits stare down from gilded frames, earls, countesses, courtiers, and warriors. The Spencers were not newcomers to nobility. Since the 16th century, they had been at the very heart of England's power, growing wealthy from sheep farming, rising through careful marriages, and weaving their way into the web of families that touched the throne. This wasn't chance. The Spencers built their family like a fortress, with alliances, inheritances, and marriages designed not just for wealth, but for legacy. What they created was more than a noble house. It was a reservoir of bloodlines, many of them linked to England's most powerful dynasties. Diana was the living product of this centuries-long strategy. No dynasty looms larger in English history than the Tudors, and Diana's ancestry intertwines with theirs in fascinating and controversial ways. Henry VIII, famous for 6 wives and endless marital drama, did not struggle to produce children. He struggled to produce legitimate ones. His acknowledged son, Henry Fitzroy, was the child of his mistress, Elizabeth Blount. Unlike most illegitimate children of the time, Fitzroy was recognized publicly and showered with honors. Though he died young, his line didn't vanish. Over generations, his connections filtered into noble families that eventually touched the Spencers. Then comes Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne. She too was a mistress of Henry VIII, and during that relationship she bore a daughter, Catherine Carey. Officially, Catherine belonged to Mary's husband, William Carey. But the timing of her birth raises questions historians have debated for centuries. Was she in fact Henry VIII's child? If she was, then Catherine Carey's descendants carried Tudor blood, and through centuries of noble marriages, that blood entered the Spencer line, which would mean that Diana was not just a princess by marriage, but a distant descendant of Henry VIII himself. Beyond the Tudors, Diana's ancestry stretches into one of the most legendary dynasties in English history, the Plantagenets. Her connection comes through the Beaufort family, descendants of John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III, and his longtime companion, Catherine Swynford. Their children were eventually legitimised by royal decree, yet a cruel twist of law barred them and their heirs from claiming the throne. This ruling didn't erase their influence. Instead, the Beauforts embedded themselves into the nobility, marrying strategically and carrying Plantagenet blood into dozens of powerful families. Over centuries, their descendants threaded through the aristocracy like golden strands hidden in the tapestry of England's history. One of those strands led directly to the Spencers, and, eventually, to Diana. It's tempting to think the Plantagenets disappeared forever on that bloody day in 1485 when Richard III fell at Bosworth Field and the Tudors seized power. But the truth is different. The dynasty never truly died. Their bloodline slipped underground, into side branches, illegitimate children, and quiet marriages that avoided the gaze of official succession law. Diana's ancestry connected her to those forgotten currents. She was, in a sense, a living echo of the Plantagenets, a reminder that dynasties never vanish completely. They survive in the shadows, waiting for the day when their descendants unknowingly step back into history's spotlight. As if Tudors and Plantagenets weren't enough, Diana's family tree also weaves into the Stuart dynasty, a house famous for drama, restoration, and rebellion. Consider Charles II, the Merry Monarch. Though he left no legitimate heir, he fathered a staggering number of children with his many mistresses. Unusually, he acknowledged several of them and granted noble titles, dukedoms of Grafton, St. Albans, Richmond, and more. These illegitimate yet powerful offspring didn't fade away. They were woven into the aristocracy, their blood flowing into families who would shape Britain for centuries. Over generations, those lines tangled with others until they reached the Spencers. Diana thus carried the legacy of a king who, though officially leaving no heirs to the throne, unofficially fathered much of Britain's noble class. Her Stuart connection doesn't end there. James II, brother of Charles II, had children with his companion Arabella Churchill, sister of John Churchill, the great Duke of Marlborough. Arabella's descendants entered noble houses that later intertwined with the Spencers. This meant Diana's ancestry absorbed yet another king's legacy, passed outside the narrow path of legitimacy but preserved through carefully chosen alliances. The effect is staggering. Diana's bloodline wasn't a single golden thread leading back to one king. It was a whole network of connections, Tudor, Plantagenet, Stuart, interlacing through time until they all converged in her. At this point, one might ask, was it all coincidence? Did the Spencers simply happen to marry into families dripping with royal blood, or was something more deliberate at work? When you study their history, a pattern emerges. Court records and marriage contracts suggest the Spencers had an uncanny ability to choose alliances that brought in royal connections. Over centuries, they married daughters of mistresses, sons of acknowledged illegitimate princes, and heirs from annulled or disputed unions. It is as if they were collecting dynastic fragments, pieces of royal puzzles cast aside by law but still alive in blood. Other noble houses pursued similar connections occasionally. The Spencers pursued them relentlessly. Every generation seemed to bring in another thread of royal DNA, until their family tree resembled a genealogical museum of English monarchy. By the time Diana was born in 1961, the Spencers had become extraordinary. They were not kings, but they carried the essence of kingship within them. They were not crowned, but their veins held echoes of nearly every dynasty that had ruled England. In effect, the Spencers became a parallel royal line, a family that never sat on the throne, but carried its spirit through time, waiting for history to circle back. And the story doesn't end in England. Through colonial marriages and distant kin, Diana's extended ancestry links her, however faintly, to America's founding fathers and early presidents. George Washington, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams appear in genealogical charts that connect the aristocracy of England to the leadership of the New World. Whether one takes these connections as fact or family legend, they reveal something bigger. English noble bloodlines, carefully preserved for centuries, quietly shaped power not just in Britain but across the Atlantic world. When Diana walked into St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, the cameras told one story, a commoner marrying a prince. But the truth beneath the veil was the opposite. Diana brought with her a heritage the Windsors desperately needed. The Windsor dynasty, originally of German origin, had rebranded itself during World War I to appear more English. By the late 20th century, its bloodlines were narrow, carefully contained through generations of intermarriage. Diana offered something different. She brought in centuries of English heritage, Tudor and Plantagenet echoes, Stuart entanglements, and a depth of lineage that the Windsors lacked. Her marriage was not just romance. It was history repairing itself, lost bloodlines reuniting with the throne after centuries apart. The story doesn't stop with Diana. Her sons, William and Harry, are the living embodiment of this ancestral reunification. They do not just carry Windsor blood, they carry Tudor blood, Stuart blood, Plantagenet echoes, and the traits of royal companions whose children were excluded from succession. When William ascends the throne, he will be the first monarch in centuries to combine legitimate succession with the forgotten bloodlines of kings excluded by politics, scandal, or law. In him, the monarchy regains dynasties it thought it had lost forever. And yet, the greatest irony is this. Diana never knew the full weight of what she carried. To the world, she was the people's princess, the fairy tale bride, the humanitarian who broke barriers. But in her veins ran 1,000 years of history, the triumphs, scandals, and secrets of England's royal past. Her death was mourned as a human tragedy, but at a deeper level, the nation may have been grieving something more, the sudden loss of the woman who embodied England's oldest bloodlines. Diana Spencer was not the commoner the palace presented her to be. She was the genetic bridge between the medieval and the modern, between the Tudors, the Plantagenets, the Stuarts, and the Windsors. Her legacy lives on, not only in memory, but in the blood of future kings. Diana's story reveals a truth the monarchy never wanted told, that the outsider bride was in fact a vessel of the very heritage the Windsors needed most. Through her, ancient dynasties returned to Buckingham Palace. Through her sons, history will reign again.